To kick it off though, I need to say that the views expressed in this presentation are reflected in our paper published in One Earth. And although the author list collaboration that went into this paper are a lot of authors that are involved in the IPCC, this does not reflect the findings of the IPCC. So please do not misunderstand or misrepresent. This is from a paper, not a finding of the IPCC. So a year ago, we embarked on a house cleaning exercise for the climate risk community. We attempted to categorize and explain the essential interactions that create climate change risk. We wanted to understand better the range of terms that have become popular in the climate science community, such as compound hazards, cascade risks, correlated climate extremes, and establish their standard use for large-scale climate assessments. So here, on behalf of my co-authors listed below, I'll present the essential conceptual contribution of where our thinking has landed for assessing and responding to complex climate change risk. I'll begin by sketching the challenges of multiple interacting drivers of risk and why it's important that they are considered in climate change risk assessment and response. Then I'll present our framework of 3 categories of complex climate change risk. Then I'll demonstrate their utility in a couple of well-known case studies, the European heat wave of 2018 and the Cape Town drought. I might throw in another one. Why is this important? We live in a highly networked world where multiple drivers of climate change risk interact, as do risks themselves. Connections among social and economic, environmental, technological systems transmit risk from one system or sector to another, creating new risks or exacerbating existing ones. These interactions include both those risks caused by climate change and those involving responses to climate change through adaptation and mitigation responses. So here, risk is understood to include both potential and negative, positive and negative outcomes. Those that have been aware of the IPCC risk framework for the last 20 years would be very familiar with this propeller diagram, where risk is understood as the interaction between a climatic hazard, vulnerability, and exposure. Now, a lot of concentration over the last 5 years in particular has concentrated on multiple interacting hazards and their effect on the severity of risk. So pre-2012, a lot of work would look at how does drought or how does heat extremes affect risk. But we've come to realize that actually when you have a coupled drought and heat extreme acting in concert with each other and affecting each other, their impact on the overall risk landscape can be much greater than the sum of the parts of those 2 climate hazards. So there's been great interest, and it's all over journals like Nature Climate Change, where coupled climatic hazards are assessed for their impact on risk. And increasingly, more and more climate hazards are being thrown into the mix. What is the effect of extreme heat that follows a tropical cyclone, for example, and its effect on health outcomes? Throw in a fourth climate hazard of flooding, storm surges associated with the climate, with a cyclone, for example. And so the majority of attention in the climate risk space has been this multivariate climate hazard assessment. But from what we know from broader social science understandings of risk, there are also multiple concurrent interacting vulnerabilities going on. Societies and individuals are not just vulnerable in one dimension, but there's many dimensions that affect vulnerability. Likewise, there are many dimensions that affect exposure. So to assess risk, you can't just look at one hazard and one vulnerability and one exposure, as difficult as that is to quantify. You also can't just look at one risk, because any local government or national government environmental minister or finance minister would tell you that at any one time there are multiple interacting risks from climate change that are on their table that they need to manage. And finally, what about response to climate change? Surely there are multiple responses to climate change which affect the overall risk landscape, either making it more severe or less severe. But how do we factor those in with the risk assessment? So in our One Earth paper, we've proposed that the propeller diagram turns into a 4-blade petal, where we present 3 categories of climate change risk. The first category of climate change risk looks at the interacting determinants of 4 determinants of risk. So that includes response in the bottom right corner. Category 1, which is pictured here, largely reflects the status quo of existing climate assessments, where a single hazard, a single vulnerability, and exposure interact. But even for category 1, the complexity of climate risk is often only partly accounted for in existing risk assessments. For instance, multiple studies project increased risk from dangerous heat for people or biodiversity based on their exposure, but do not also include vulnerability or response to heat stress. Category 1 goes further than the existing paradigm by explicitly recognizing that a response to climate change can also potentially be a driver of risk. This is important because for some risks, responses to climate change or a lack of response, inertia in response, may be the dominant driver of potential risk outcomes. Both physical climate risks and transition risks need to be thought of as part of climate change risk. And a response can be a human intervention directly targeting the risk, but also an adaptation response in another sector, or a greenhouse gas mitigation project that affects the risk being assessed. All of which needs to be factored in. For example, planting trees could be a great way to absorb carbon that's in the atmosphere. But it's also a significant threat to habitat loss and biodiversity if it's done in a monoculture way. So that's category 1, which emphasizes response. It's quite difficult in the first place, and I think the majority of our work for the next 5 years will be fleshing out the role of response as a determinant of climate change risk. But we've got 2 more categories of complexity that get a little bit crazy. And so this is category 2, where we try to flesh out the multivariate interactions of the multiple determinants of risk. So category 2 is distinguishable from category 1 because it considers the interactions of risk both within and among the determinants of risk, namely hazard, exposure, vulnerability, and response. Category 2 expands the risk assessment space by highlighting the need for equal attention to be given to interactions amongst vulnerability, exposure, and response, whereas the current climate science is very hazard focused. Interactions among individual drivers can be uni or bidirectional, and we use the term compound to describe the interaction types because it's widely used in the literature, especially for climate hazards. It's neutral with respect to interactions of positive or negative outcomes. Risk can also be affected by the aggregation of independent drivers. And so we've got the idea of aggregating drivers of risk in there. This diversity of interactions in category 2 makes it highly complex, comprising interactions among the drivers of risk across human, natural, and technological systems. Category 3 considers additionally the interactions of multiple risks, including both those associated with climate change and those related to other drivers. For example, a multiple breadbasket failure can affect financial, food, human security, and other major financial losses to agricultural insurers globally, and enhance potential for civil unrest. Risk assessment in category 3 is inherently cross-sectoral, as this focuses on interactions among multiple risks across different sectors and regions. And it's important because it's a reality that people need to manage regardless of the level of quantitative assessment available to inform decision-making. Each risk is assessed independently. The severity of individual risks and the overall risk landscape will likely be misestimated. In category 3, each risk may have its own set of determinants. So behind each of these propellers, there are hazards, exposures, vulnerabilities, as well as responses. But the risks themselves are also potentially interacting and affecting each other. And I'll get into a case study to flesh that out for you just now. So those are the 3 categories of risk that we have. We've got category 1, where we've added the response petal. Category 2, where we've got multivariate drivers within each determinant of risk. And category 3, where we've got interactions among risks. So how does this look in the real world? And we'll take a couple of empirical examples. One of the most well-studied extreme compound climate events is the European heat wave of 2018. And there'll be some great science adding to that out of this last year's research on 2021 heat waves. But if we open it up a little bit and think what actually went down in the European heat wave that made it particularly severe, looking at just one risk outcome, risk to infrastructure, based on the existing research, this is how we can flesh it out. Sorry. Between May and August 2018, different sub-regions of Europe experienced multiple concurrent heat extremes. They were compounded by severe drought conditions. Low water levels in the rivers led to restrictions for shipping. Nuclear power plants were shut down because of insufficient water for cooling, and railway lines buckled under the heat. Crop yield reductions of up to 50% were recorded across Central and Northern Europe, alongside losses to livestock sectors. Now, a category 1 assessment of this case would concentrate only on a subset of interactions of a single risk. For example, risk to transport would be described as the interaction of extreme heat, thermal tolerance of the rail infrastructure, the length of time the relevant infrastructure was exposed to the prolonged heat conditions, and potentially how low water levels during the drought resulted in restrictions. But a Category 1 assessment like this, although it could be conducted for a range of domains of value, such as tourism, electricity generation, or agricultural production, it excludes key information because the severity of risk was only determined by the interactions among the multiple drivers within each determinant of risk, better described as a Category 2 risk landscape. For example, the interacting drivers of strong winds, drought, and extreme heat led to the severe wildfires that resulted in extensive damage to infrastructure and extended over popular tourist areas, just as we've seen over the last couple of weeks in Turkey and in Greece. In this case, more than 100 lives were lost in the Attica region of Greece. The risk to infrastructure from wildfire was further compounded by ecological responses to the early spring, where increased vegetation growth contributed to a faster than normal soil moisture depletion, interacting with human responses, including poor spatial planning and inadequate coordination of evacuation and firefighting measures. In addition to risk to infrastructure from wildfire, vulnerability of infrastructure was determined by the dependency of both energy and transport on available water for electricity generation and shipping, while transport infrastructure was further vulnerable to extreme heat. Now, a similar Category 2 assessment could be undertaken for multiple other sectors, such as agricultural productivity, food security, or food prices. And it highlights the interactions of drivers that can have different interaction effects. Now, I'll jump into another case study quickly. We're moving from a Category 2 that looks at the multivariate interactions of drivers of risk to Category 3, thinking about the Cape Town drought. I chose this as it's an example that I'm sure many folk here are quite familiar with. So urban areas are often where interactions between social, economic, environmental, and infrastructure systems are revealed during climate extremes, and cities facing water scarcity will increasingly need to manage complex climate change risks. Effective responses to the Cape Town drought were delayed due to the political risk of declaring a disaster and a lack of feasible water supply alternatives. Responses became increasingly urgent during early 2018 as the potential of a day zero event became possible. And the risk of day zero was anticipated to cascade to affect risk to health, economic output, and security. But responses by different groups interacted to generate and amplify risk to the municipal finance. In particular, as elites invested in private off-grid water supplies, risk to municipal revenue collections from the newly off-grid households and businesses. The risk from people going off-grid compounded the financial risk that was already faced by the city. And that led to further risks to the reputation of the incumbent administration. And the combination of these risks was not well considered in planning scenarios before the drought, but have been quite a hard lesson learnt. As the city's municipal budget was disrupted, political risks from capital-intensive responses such as desalination, groundwater abstraction, were compounded with their limited response capacity. Another good example of how risks interact is risk from sea level rise, which can cascade to risk of stranded assets. If homeowners can't get insurance, their property values will be depressed. This can cascade to a risk of foreclosure on loans from banks, risk of banks having to maintain higher deposit ratios and lend less, and risk of greatest impact on the most vulnerable who are less able to pay, such as the elderly, low-income residents, or exposed municipalities. So where does this take us? Our horizon scan for taking this research project forward. Firstly, we want to really develop the response petal. And that's because for some risks, responses to climate change may be the dominant driver of potential risk outcomes. Both physical climate risks and transition risks need to be thought of as part of climate change risk. And a response can be a human intervention targeting the risk, but can also be an adaptation response in another sector or greenhouse gas mitigation project that affects the risk being assessed. Two ways that we're developing this work at the moment is looking at it through the lens of, or applied to the idea of managed retreat. How do municipalities manage sea level rise and its effects? How do you retreat back from compound coastal risk? And we're working with some great colleagues on that. And another more extreme climate response is solar geoengineering. How might solar geoengineering be deployed, and with what risks will it be deployed? And what is the risk of switching it off once it is deployed? So we're trying to look at some pragmatic examples and also some crazy out there examples that hopefully we don't have to use, but we might. So that's it. That's the 3 categories of complex climate change risk. Thanks for your time and listening. Happy to take some questions. Thanks.
Thanks for this, Nick. It was very insightful, and kind of seeing that progression from the initial propeller model and how this idea of response also actually interacts on risk and influences some of the actions that happen and the exposure and the vulnerability. If anybody has any questions that they would like to raise, please feel free to put it in the chat and then we can respond to them. And if anybody wants to speak, you can raise your hand and you can ask your question directly also. I mean, I just want to also say that the examples that you gave were quite nice to see. And I was wondering what your reflections are in terms of what's happening now with the pandemic and kind of the ongoing, flooding issues that we see in Cape Town, or, there's been the floods in other parts of the world that have had quite a huge impact. And yeah, how does that kind of, in terms of the climate risks that are happening and the interactions with that and changing, if you have any reflections on that.
Thanks, Joy. Yeah. So, I mean, COVID is just the perfect example of a confluence and aggregation of risks to health that interact with broader social exposure and vulnerabilities. Yeah, we did some work around complex climate change risk and COVID, and presented it at a town hall event at the American Geophysical Union last year. And quite interesting in that space was at a policy maker or decision maker's perspective, it's all about the response here. Like, how do you quantify it? How do you cost for it? What is the risk of not responding? Can I get away with not responding? What is the risk to my reputation in that situation? But in the climate space more than the COVID space, I think what we've seen in Southern Africa last year was particularly in Zimbabwe, where there was a severe drought, and people were collecting water from standpipes for a long time, having to stand in those queues and be exposed to COVID while being forced into the queue because of extreme drought was a compounding arrangement for exposure to COVID. And I think the more and more we think about the interactions of climate risk with broader social exposure arrangements, broader social vulnerability arrangements, I think it'll become more legible to us how severe risks under climate change are, and particularly for the most vulnerable in society.
Oh, thanks for that. I see there's a few questions coming through. I don't know, Petra, would you like to maybe talk to that question?
Okay, hi Nick. Hi Joy. Nick, I was just trying to get my head around a bit of like a normative, like climate risk can be normative. So, and how do we know what's acceptable versus unacceptable level of risk? So loss of lives, morally, we know that's unacceptable. And but versus other levels of climate risk, loss of households, assets versus, so all of these are different. They can be seen as unacceptable or acceptable, but it's normative. And I don't think this is well integrated in current risk assessments and, you know, in terms of how we prioritize how to manage or deal with what risks. And I just thought it would be great to hear your thoughts on this, whether you think it's important, whether it's covered in the literature or not.
Yeah, like such a great question, Petra. Thanks, eh? So I agree with you. Due to the value dimension of risk, it can be vague. It can be hijacked by certain political agendas as to what risks get prioritized for assessment, let alone for planning response allocations. Definitely from an IPCC perspective, the value dimension of risk is explicit. And so there is no written in stone definition of what is valuable and what is not valuable. But for example, the way that gets negotiated through in an IPCC space is a range of sectors are prioritized for risk assessment. And based on the science, we understand that Africa needs a climate risk assessment for food. We need a risk assessment for water, for human settlements, for health, etc., etc. And out of those large basket categories, can sort of hone in onto smaller scale dimensions of those sectoral categories that are exposed to climate risk. And that's probably why it's really important to have socially engaged climate change research that concentrates or makes clearer, makes more legible multidimensional vulnerability to climate change and intersectionalities in society where certain groups are more exposed, less able to respond, or more vulnerable to climate change. In order for that to go through to the higher level assessment of under climate risk to water, who is most vulnerable and who should resilience efforts target. Yeah, but yeah, there's a massive value dimension there.
Thanks, Nick. I think there's a question around the main use of this framework. Do you see it as being preventative for climate risk? So trying to model what might happen in order to prepare for it. And if so, does this framework also account for uncertainty or probability of risk in some way?
Yeah, thanks. So risk from climate change is present and future. It's here. on our doorstep. So there's an immediacy to the application of this framework, as well as hopefully looking for it over the next 100 years or more. It's very difficult to integrate the data requirements and the information requirements across multiple disciplines in order to quantify risk from hazard, exposure, vulnerability, and response, as well as integrating in ranges of uncertainty. However, there is a lot of work going into that space, and I would encourage you to have a look at some of the work by Rob Lempert or Judy Lawrence. Rob Lempert works for Rand Corporation. Judy Lawrence works for University of Auckland, and both of them for the last couple of years have focused heavily on storyline approaches to climate risk, where integration of broader data sets is included in the more climate sciencey hazard space. For example, they've done a lot of work around integrating local indigenous knowledge in storylines, and how can those be picked up by adaptation responses that include climate projections in the storyline. On the more technical side, Rob Lempert's work with Rand Corporation focuses on decision-making under uncertainty. So robust decision-making is his big field, and strength tests, policies, programs for ranges of climate uncertainty. And in our paper, we point towards those in the sort of final section as this is how it can potentially be done. But yeah, there's a long way to go before it will be, I'd say, used by a local municipality at a quantitative level. It could quite quickly be picked up at an expert elicitation level, but yeah.
Thanks, Nick. Another question is, risks resulting from compounding extreme events can be really hard to assess and even manage. So just what are your reflections on that? And I think sort of linked to that, there was a question about how do you get people to take action without confusing them with the complexity?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so there's a lot of behavioral science going into understanding what is the adequate quality and quantity of information required to communicate climate risk in a way that people would respond to it and not just sort of put their head in the sand and be too terrified by it. And so there is some good research that is opening up that space. But to the first question, I'd say one of the co-authors on here, Martin van Alst, is the director of Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center. And his real big interest in this project was their climate response imperatives as a humanitarian organization. And on a day-to-day basis, their frontline managers are managing multiple compound interacting risks, some of which come from climate change, others come from just local contextual fragility. And I 100% agree with the tone of the question that it is incredibly difficult. But I think the value of this framework is if we are making response more explicit in how climate change risk unfolds for the responder and for those that couldn't care less, then at least it gives us a bit of a handle on how to manage it. Because up till now, the integration of response, like how do we respond, has been like secondary or treated by a different group of thinkers to those that are actually assessing climate risk. So it's more an effort of let's try integrate response as a determinant. Yeah.
Thanks. I'm going to invite Stephanie to ask her question.
Yes, hi everyone. Stephanie Midgley here, Department of Agriculture in the Western Cape. I've been struggling with this question for a while, and it's not an easy one, and that is that there is so much pressure now being brought to bear on livestock farming across the world and also in South Africa. And what's happening is that we absolutely have to reduce emissions. And so now responses are being brought in and farmers are pressured to reduce production of livestock. And this, they're already having to deal with the risks of the climate change on their farming operations directly. So now they've got this additional risk, which really threatens the operations, and often they aren't able to do anything else in those areas. There's no water, so it's not a question of switching from livestock to crops or anything like that. So the question that comes up, what is a just transition? I mean, when we talk about just transition, we often think about the coal miners, but I think people don't often think about the fate of our farmers. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie. That's, massive point there. We have another paper that's in review at PNAS at the moment, climate risk to livestock for Africa for the coming century. And it's yes, the land use challenge is massive, and the consumer attitude towards water that goes into the production of beef and dairy, for example, is massive. But coming down the line, the risk of heat death for livestock is also severe. And so I 100% agree with you that a just transition needs to consider the breadth of livelihoods across society, and that just focusing on the truck drivers of coal mines is very myopic, because climate change is everything change. It affects every sector that's exposed. Yeah.
Thanks. I think keep asking questions if there's any more that anybody would like to write in the chat. I see another one saying, can you please elaborate on how these determinants of risk would typically be assessed, and how are the relationships between drivers of risk determined?
Yeah, thanks. I don't want to put everybody to sleep, because this is more looking at the framework side than the quantitative crunching. But I'll paint a broad picture for you. So at the moment, the strongest science that's going into multivariate determinants and multivariate drivers of risk comes from, firstly, a concentration on climate hazards, and secondly, on ecosystems and their response to changes in climate variables. On the climate hazard side, I'll point you towards the work of Colin Raymond and Sonia Senadaratni, and another guy called Zeichler, who's at ETH Zurich. And they are heavy quantitative folk who look at the correlated extremes of climate events, and then integrate that with local socioeconomic data to look at geospatially, to look at how anthropogenic climate change attributed event will affect a receiving environment. On the ecosystem side, I think most people on the call here would be familiar with a lot of work that's gone into coral reefs, that's gone into plant and crop sensitivities to climate variables, where from empirical work that looks at the response capacity of organisms, some positive, most negative to climate change. What impacts are they having? And then from that, extrapolating projections to the future under future global warming levels. Those projections are continually being updated. So at the moment, we're working from CMIP 6, which is the most up-to-date models of future climate sensitivity to carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere. And so a major challenge for this research moving forward is the commensurability of multiple data sets in order for the integrated assessment to happen. And there are some folk out there that are trying and pushing integrated assessment models, but none of which include response to climate change. So that's the sort of next cutting edge of moving climate risk models to be more integrated and factor in the storylines that can be created around response. Yeah.
Thanks for that. I think if anybody wants to follow up on any of the papers or the names suggested, then maybe I can put Nick's email address in the chat, and then you can feel free to email him and ask for that. I just want to invite Thomas to ask his question.
Thanks, Joy. Thanks, Nick, for a very inspiring, I think, informative model. It's quite a novel approach to looking at risk than the standard risk models. I think in terms of resilience science and looking at positive and negative feedback loops, obviously you could apply that in each of your petals, as it were. Because I think what we're busy seeing is, especially in California, there's data coming out that's looking at these persistent positive feedback loops which have been created, and it's possibly, an ecological tipping point where the place burns every single year. So, the risk there is actually increasing year by year, and they caught back, they caught in this positive feedback loop on a yearly basis. Maybe just something in your thoughts around that.
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. 100%. And I think that highlights the importance that risk is not bounded by time and space, that it actually, there can be temporal and spatial compounding of risk. You see it particularly around Amir Agachorchak has done some really good work on wildfire in California that looks at how the heavy rains that could follow particularly severe wildfire, that also follows extreme heat and drought, that final rainfall that strips the landscape has a disproportionate impact on the ecology, and sometimes an irreversible impact. So 100%. It was really difficult for us to create the figure for category 2, because as you can imagine, wading through the literature on complex climate change risk, and we delved a bit into the complexity work. As soon as you draw one interaction, you're like, well, what about all the others? And it just becomes a spider's web of interactions. So what we're trying to do here is just present like a minimalist framework, just to spark the mind, but in reality, there's so much going on, and it's dynamic and changing all the time. Like vulnerability isn't static there, and exposure isn't, response isn't static either. So yeah, nice point, Thomas. Thanks.
Thanks. We have just a few minutes left, so if there's any burning questions or comments, please raise your hand or put it in the chat. I think there's another question here that's asking about how does complex, adaptive, and iterative responsiveness work in risk management? So is there a requisite menu of responses developed beforehand, and then the best one deployed and tried, and then adapted, if not the best approach? How does it work?
Tough question. Well, I think so. A lot of Rob Lempert's work that's working with municipalities is quite iterative in that sense. And it's the pace of iterations that count. So how fast do you have to revise your plans, and at what degree of detail does those revisions require? I can give one example. There's a new paper out on the critical water shortages disaster plan of the city of Cape Town, where everybody knows Cape Town as a city is more climate aware than most African cities. It has a climate adaptation plan, etc., etc. Most of its management are capacitated in an understanding of climate change, but they had no idea about how to plan for it at a street level when there was a run-up to a potential shut-off of water supplies because of the Cape Town drought. And that paper that gives learnings from the Cape Town drought on the critical water shortages disaster plan shows the importance of data at the right level for assessment, planning at street levels of response capacity, and adequate finance for that. All of which was way beyond existing planning scenarios for the city of Cape Town, but which is now on the radar. So, I mean, proof will be in the pudding. There might be another day zero coming down the pipeline and within the next 10 years, and the new response capacity that's built in or not will be a test of have we learnt from previous shocks or stresses. I think in this case, this framework is emphasizing there is potential to reduce the severity of risk if in your understanding of risk, you're factoring in how you're responding and accounting for lack of response at various stages. But it's a very tough question, and there's no one-size-fits-all answer for that, I would presume. And I think if anybody had one, they'd be a bit crazy. It has to be figured out and managed at a local level, and then dynamically improved over time.
Well, thanks for that, Nick. It doesn't seem like there are any other questions coming up. Yeah, I just want to thank you for presenting to us today and for kind of digging deep into, the complex interactions between drivers of risk and how, we can also think about this in terms of applications, and some examples that you showed us were really useful for that. Thanks to everybody also for attending and for asking your questions. If you want to get hold of Nick directly, his email address is still on the screen. So feel free to follow up with him directly. And we look forward to seeing you at one of our future webinars. If you have any questions for me, feel free to send an email. You can find me at joywaddell@sun.ac.za. And if you are interested also in presenting at a future webinar, feel free to get in touch. Well, I don't know if you have any final comments, Nick.
No, but yeah, Thanks, everyone. Privileged to come here and share my work with you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful day.